Welcome everyone, and I'm just briefly going to show you the agenda. We've got quite a packed agenda today. There'll be a number of different speakers presenting the highlights from the report, which I hope you've all seen. It's been published a couple of weeks ago, and we'll look at the background and scope, the key findings, the priorities for change, which is hopefully what will stimulate a number of comments and questions from yourselves about what you're doing around this already. And then finally, next steps, and we'll have a big chunk at the end for Q&A where we can pick up on some of the issues and concerns raised by the project presenters. So, Sally Shearer, why don't you kick us off? Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. My name's Sally Shearer. I've been a member of the panel now for 3 years, and I'm delighted to co-host this event on behalf of the panel with Dr. Alison Steele, my colleague on the panel, who has led the panel parts of this review. Before I go any further, I'd just like to thank all of those safeguarding partnerships who have assisted in this piece of work. Your input has been invaluable. So if you're on the call, we're really grateful for what you have done. So this report, this project, it was commissioned by the panel, but it's actually been undertaken by Research in Practice, University of East Anglia and VKPP to evaluate how local areas can be supported to maximise learning from safeguarding practice reviews. So as will unfold, the panel, government and safeguarding partnerships now need to take consideration of the findings. I'll start with some introductions. So Alison, did you just want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Alison Steele. As you said, I'm a member of the panel. I'm a paediatrician by professional background, and I was one of the lead members for this project.
Thanks. Marianne?
Hi, I'm Marianne MacDonald, Deputy Director at Research and Practice.
Thanks. And Jeanette?
Hello everyone, I'm Jeanette Cossa. I'm a Professor of Social Work at the University of East Anglia.
And last but not least, Nikki.
Hi everyone, my name's Nikki Porter. I'm one of the National Reform Facilitators for Policing. I work for the VKPP and the College of Policing.
Thanks very much. So this is the panel. Many of you who attend our webinars will be very familiar with this slide. We're an independent body set up in 2018 to identify, commission and oversee reviews of serious safeguarding incidents. And as you can see, we're a multi-agency forum just to reflect the multi-agency nature of safeguarding and what happens across safeguarding partnerships. As already outlined, the panel commissioned this project to understand more about the current approach and the value that safeguarding partnerships place on learning and improvement. And I think what we all understand is that reviews are resource heavy in terms of people's time and finances, and therefore it's really important that we get maximum impact from them. What you're about to see in the presentation is that this learning needs to be continuous if we are to address the systemic issues. And what we all understand is that reviews are more complex than simply working through an action plan. So I'm now going to hand over to Alison, and the team will talk you through the project and lead you to their 6 priorities for change that Research in Practice and their partners have set out for our consideration. Alison, over to you.
Thank you, Sally. I'm just going to say a few brief words about background and scope for this project. The questions that we were asking ourselves was, how is the current local child safeguarding practice review approach delivered? What value do safeguarding partnerships place on the learning and improvement from serious incidents? The initial aim actually of the project was to focus on local child safeguarding practice reviews, really because of some concerns we had about their quality. But early in the project, it became apparent that we would need to expand our lines of inquiry to include both serious incident notifications and rapid reviews. Moving forward, became obvious that from field work that actually the sort of flow of how notifications, rapid reviews and practice reviews happened wasn't always entirely clear. So I'm really briefly going to run through this. So the first stage is actually a determination of whether a notification is needed. So that determination of whether the criteria is met for a serious incident notification is actually decided by the local authority, who notifies the panel, DFE and Ofsted. I think different partnerships have different ways of including partners in making those decisions. The partners then meet and undertake a rapid review of all the notified serious incidents. The rapid review needs to conclude with a decision about whether there needs to be a local child safeguarding practice review. The rapid reviews are sent to a panel, we read them all, and we do feed back to you both about the quality of the rapid review, the decision making about whether an LCSPR is required, and also we often make some comments upon what we feel are the key lines of inquiry that we've seen from the information from the rapid review. In terms of setting up for undertaking a rapid review, it's important that there's a clarity of purpose. It's important that the family are informed. Thought goes into designing and commissioning, and I know that there are sometimes issues with commissioning independent authors to do these reviews, and then how local partnerships are going to manage the process, and also there are often parallel processes that impact, and particularly I'm thinking around criminal proceedings. So in terms of running the practice review, it's important to set up the team. It's appropriate to assemble information from the rapid review, and maybe there are some gaps in information that need to be sought. There should be practitioner and management involvement, family involvement if appropriate, and then there needs to be an analysis and conclusions around the learning. Then in terms of the outputs, there's a final report. There may be other outputs. There needs to be consideration. Most we suggest that reports are written so that they can be published without impinging on confidentiality issues. There is a quality and assurance process and a governance process that needs to be gone through locally in terms of sign-off, and then how you're going to deal with publication and dissemination. And then in terms of the last step, determining improvement action and evaluating impact, this is really important. So what actions are needed, what further learning needs to happen, and actually how has this changed practice, how has this changed local systems over the shorter and the longer term. So that's a brief run through of the process. I am going to hand over to Marianne, I think.
That's lovely. Thanks very much, Alison. And it's lovely to see you all here today. And we're so glad that you're interested in this work. And we're looking forward to sharing it with you. Now, we're not going to assume you've read the report, but we hope that once you hear what we've got to say, it might make you want to go and read it there, because there's some really interesting things in the report that are really applicable to practice. And there are things that you can start thinking about today in terms of the work that you're doing in your own safeguarding partnership. So as we go through the slides, where we're going to give you a summary, we're not going to read the slides, we're going to talk around them. And what we want to do is trigger some thinking. So do think about the questions that you want to ask and add them to the chat. And that would be really helpful for us to be thinking about later on. So in terms of how we approach this project, we're really keen to understand the evidence and to think about how do we maximise learning from safeguarding reviews? How do we make that difference to children that's real? And how do we know that? And so we spent quite a lot of time talking to different people, practitioners, reviewers, families. And one of the things that we really wanted to make sure was that we were threading equity, equality, diversity and inclusion right the way through the project to make sure that it was really strongly felt and understood. And you'll see some recommendations in the report around that. So we worked collaboratively with a range of people, and we worked as a collaborative partnership as well with UEA Research and Practice and VKPP to work as a project team to bring this work together. And so one of the really important things that we were thinking about as we were working through this project was that thinking around something that you might not have heard about before, and that's system stewardship. And system stewardship comes from the human learning system, and you can look that up and find out more about it online. And it looks at thinking about the system that we work in, the multiple systems that we work in, and the relationships that they have with each other. And system stewardship is about how we ourselves, each of us as individuals and collectively, look after and care for and nurture the system. And so as we go through the rest of these slides where we're talking about the learning from this project, think about your role as part of that system and your role as a system steward, and what is there from the learning in this project that you can take away and think about in your safeguarding partnership today and put into practice. So I'm going to introduce you now to Emma Smale, who led the project and did the majority of the work from the research and practice side in this project. And she's going to now take you through some of the learning, and then we'll introduce you to others as we move on. So enjoy this session. I hope you're all having your lunch and getting the benefit from it. But do think about what is there for you to take away from this session and put into practice tomorrow, because that's the important thing. What difference will it make? Emma.
Thank you, Marianne. Great to be here. So the first thing I'd like to talk about, which was identified through this project, is that there isn't at the moment a framework or any structure to help partnerships identify the contributing factors to incidents, to really sort of help to think through where learning is needed and at what level of the system. That combined with a lack of capacity and also a dearth of independent reviewers and potentially a sort of a lack of coherence around the qualifications and preparedness for reviews means that there can be a focus on what happened opposed to some of those more systemic issues. What we were finding is that there is often a focus on practice issues, and therefore learning gets translated into what is relevant for practitioners. And common outputs from reviews are things like further training, further tools, or adapting or creating policies and protocols. And yet what we understood from professionals in the project is that there is a desire for deeper learning, sort of get beyond some of these questions around how we do things and how to do them right, to move on to something slightly more reflective and reflexive, to examine, for example, the factors that influence certain practices, or indeed to open up a critique of existing norms and structures. So there is certainly a sense that we could be doing some deeper learning, but capacity in the system really isn't there to do that. There is also a really clear understanding that learning is emergent throughout the process. It isn't something that is produced simply at the end of a linear timeline. Learning is happening and is dynamic from the earliest points of an incident through those conversations at the earliest point of referral across multi-agency partners. And there is a real understanding and recognition of the complexity of the environment that you are all working in. So with that complexity in mind, it is really hard to actually describe and capture impact. And there was a great amount of interest in how to do that and how to do that better. But what we saw is that actually, without a better recognition of the complexity in the system and really the meta reality of how change occurs, given that outcomes for children are really influenced by so many actors, so many different agencies, so many different elements, that actually it isn't surprising that partnerships find impact hard to capture. However, there is a sense that it is helpful to have smart recommendations, which can really help partnerships to think through actions and action planning. However, again, those smart recommendations tend to locate change in frontline practice. And although that may well be needed, there may need to be more work done to look at other levels of the system that need to change and respond, and those systemic issues that indeed many of you talked about, and that many reviews will surface, but in some cases national recommendations are not being made, with a view that actually it doesn't necessarily make that much difference, or perhaps that local safeguarding practice reviews really should be more focused on the local. So some healthy discussion and debate emerged through our project about that. And on the next slide, you'll just see that we have started to question through this work how we can go beyond that sort of defensive reasoning, you know, actually where reviews become overtly or overly focused on protecting interests, to moving into a more reflective and reflexive space, and what that would mean for capacity and capabilities in the system. And Nikki will say a little bit more about that now.
Thank you, Emma. Yes, so what came across strongly in the research was the complex environment in which partnerships operate, and how adept partnerships need to be when working with each other's organisations and distinct cultures. Customs and priorities are variable, including capacity and capability. We heard that learning cultures vary between agencies, with some being more reflective than others, and there are variable levels of preparedness and knowledge about the process, which Emma's just alluded to. Capacity to learn within the system can be limited where resources are stretched and diverted, especially when many resources are undertaking multiple reviews, and partnerships can struggle to engage in deeper learning, which might take longer and require further opportunities for reflection and exploration. Overwhelm and learning fatigue amongst professionals was clearly evident throughout this work. Professionals are often responsible for other reviews with different thresholds and demands, and they can overlap and be repetitious. And the emotional impact for those involved in reviews was also highlighted, and this can often be compounded by other parallel processes such as child death reviews and criminal investigations. We also spent some time talking about the critical role of the business unit, and this was a strong theme. It was reported that capacity issues affected the ability to create time and space for learning, and also for measuring impact or to look back and check on what worked. And there is an over-reliance on the business unit to coordinate, but they may not have sufficient capacity, capability, authority, or indeed independence to balance the representation from all agencies. And disparities in funding arrangements also featured as a key capacity consideration for the business units. It was also recognised that there's been no change to the accreditation of reviewers, and it was highlighted that informal contracting requirements and a dearth of reviewers can add time and pressure into the process. And reviewers themselves identified a need for greater peer connection and professional development. It was also noted that training and development is actually out of step, for example, with other processes such as domestic homicide reviews. And I just want to touch upon geographical boundaries. Geographical boundaries, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, are rarely coterminous, and health and police have developed structures, processes and teams to respond specifically to CSPRs at a sub-regional and regional level. Partnerships also recognised that sharing learning at a regional and national level was important to their partnerships, and they described that an increased availability of data, insight, trends and themes are really helpful in identifying and making decisions where further learning is needed. So we've been thinking about whether better regional collaboration, including shared data, insights and resources, could provide opportunities to engage in deeper learning through thematic reviews and build additional capacity and capability for partnerships. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to hand over to Jeanette.
Thank you, Nikki. So I'm going to talk briefly about EEDI. This was a really important part of the project, and we benefited hugely from an EEDI framework, which was developed by our colleague Laurel Brown, which you can find in the appendix to the report. And I think that would be of interest to practitioners as well. So we found a lack of confidence in EEDI expressed by safeguarding partnerships. And this lack of confidence could impact on the recording of protected characteristics, including gender, race, disability, sexual orientation. If these things aren't recorded, then it may not be clear if there are disparities in commissioning or conversion rates between SINs, rapid reviews and LCSPRs. So that's an important factor. And the other thing that this lack of confidence might impact on is the extent to which the review is able to consider the lived experience of the child and their family in terms of their intersectional identity. However, we did find that there was a contrast when we asked a big question about EEDI. We'd get one kind of answer, but we actually found a lot of detail when we were talking to people about the individual case, which was the subject of the LCSPR as part of the project. So people were able to give very specific examples of diversity and inclusion and how they'd considered families' needs. So, for example, ensuring that they had an expert on SEND if the young person had an EHCP as part of the review process. What we did find was that there was a concentration when thinking about EEDI on children and family identities, and much less discussion of practitioner and workforce identities in terms of protected characteristics and the possible impact that might have on relationships and on the work. There was also little consideration of structural inequalities, including the experience of racism and how that might impact on families. So we also held some workshops, and there were many ideas for change around EEDI. These included practical suggestions, such as including an EEDI tab on assessments, thinking about EEDI in terms of rapid review templates, and also thinking about intersectionality in the terms of reference for LCSPRs. But this went along with an emphasis on the need to avoid a tick box mentality and the recognition that it can be hard to surface cultural bias, so that the EEDI work needs to go across all safeguarding work and be considered at all levels of the system. So we also wanted to pay attention to involving children, families and practitioners in the LCSPR process. And obviously these are very different stakeholders, so it's quite hard to give it due consideration in one slide. We did try to talk to both safeguarding partnership practitioners, but also family members as part of this project. And practitioners really valued the involvement of children and families in the work. There was recognition that it was sensitive and difficult, and much consideration was given to who should contact family members, how their opinions might be sought, and recognising that the children and families may in fact not wish to be involved at this stage in a process. But as well as there being a kind of moral value to involving children and families, there were many concrete examples given about how children and families' involvement added to the learning. Examples were, for example, a mother who drew attention to the fact that the father of the child wasn't really mentioned in the report. And the reviewer concerned said, actually, the mother was right. And we went back and we looked at the report and thought, more generally about the absence of fathers and what there was around that. So that's a good concrete example. We did talk to 4 family members as part of the research, and they had really variable experiences. So we talked to a child who was subject to a review alongside his father. And they were involved, they felt involved in giving their opinions, but they weren't involved in a feedback loop. So they said they'd received their report in the post. By contrast, one grandmother that we spoke to had quite a restorative experience, which involved a high degree of relationship-based work, including giving her feedback on subsequent training and how her experience was making a difference to local practitioners in the local area. We also talked to safeguarding partnerships and frontline practitioners about their experience of reviews, and everybody valued the input of frontline practitioners and thought it was essential. emphasising the importance of preparation and follow-up. We talked to 15 frontline practitioners, including people from health, police, children's social care, education, and one housing officer. And they gave a slightly different account in that they said they found it hard to avoid a culture of blame in the work. So when they knew that they were going to be involved, this caused a huge amount of anxiety. They said they felt a variation in how supported and prepared they felt. And this varied in terms of the agency that they came from, and also the experience around them in that agency. So if they had colleagues who'd experienced it and could explain the process, that was a great support. Generally, they found that their support was lacking around the time of publication. In fact, one of the practitioners that we spoke to spent most of the interview with me, well, to some extent was crying at regular points in the interview and said that she'd not been able to read the report. So this example and also the experience of children and families points to, I suppose, a kind of trauma-informed approach to involving both children and families and frontline practitioners, recognising the sensitivities of this work, and also to the importance of involving them in feedback loops and in co-production throughout the process. Again, as with EEDI, I think the emphasis was that this can't be something that only happens at the point of review. It really needs to be embedded throughout the kind of safeguarding processes and in all the work that we do. So I'm going to now hand over to Emma, I think, for the next slide.
Thank you, Jeanette. So what we wanted to share with you today was the idea that learning really does need to be identified and responded to at every level of the system, because without this sort of systemic systems approach, without thinking about the collective responsibility for change, and without the capacity in the system to do that deeper learning, it is possible that we will continue to find that there are limits to what LCSPRs and rapid reviews can do in terms of addressing some of the most pervasive and persistent complex problems faced in the safeguarding system. However, it is a challenge if we think about what is required here and the aspiration of working together. We do need this to go beyond a single agency and a single culture and practice. And as referenced by colleagues, you know, there are different learning cultures and different ways of engaging in these processes across the different agencies and partners involved. So how do we create a truly multi-agency learning system, which means that everyone across every level of the system takes responsibility for improving the experiences of children and families? So we propose in our report that practical constraints must not limit ambition, and we have been clear that in the current context, which ongoing pressures on budgets and resources and a good deal of restructure and structural change, again, in the systems that are involved in reviews, it is a challenging time. Therefore, we have set out 6 priorities for change, which we propose are sort of critical first steps, if you like, to catalyse positive change. If you read the report, you will see that we have linked these together. They are linked together and they've come together as a group. We can't take one without the other. And that also reflects what we would need to see in terms of the systems leadership and the stewardship that Marianne mentioned earlier on. The fact that we all have to take a role, but certainly across government and government departments and at a regional level, we need to see the political leadership that will ensure that there is capacity in the system. So what does that mean? The 6 priorities of change then. First of all, we are calling for the panel national government to consider how to increase capacity in safeguarding partnerships really using and building on existing regional improvement structures. Now, these might look different for police, for health, for education, and for local authorities. So there is something about what does it mean to maximise existing resources, but also how to do this across boundaries, which are often not coterminous, and also introduce complexities into the capacity that is needed. So part of that needs to be a concentration on how to elevate and share promising practice, but also how to think more carefully about sharing resources and potentially undertaking more thematic reviews across regional footprints. The second priority relates to the recruitment, accreditation and professional development of independent reviewers. This is a long overdue place for change. Recommendations of this nature have been made for a decade or more, and it is important because it does affect partnerships' ability to undertake LCSPR that are of high quality, that give the partnership confidence that they will be able to really hold their own system to account, but also in the current context of restrained resources, as has already been noted in the chat. And of course, ensuring that we have the skills and the qualifications and the deep expertise that's required to do this work well and in a trauma-informed way does need to be supported at a systems level. So the third priority that we have proposed is for the panel to develop and implement a learning framework. What does this mean? This means a framework that is simple enough but provides consistency and coherence across partnerships to help support decision making, so that the implementation of learning is something that happens throughout reviews, but also helps partners to identify and enable learning at every level of the system, to give permission to make those national recommendations, but also to expect a response at every level and across agencies. The fourth priority is to really address this gap in capacity and capability around EEDI, a protocol and toolkit to really ensure that there is systemic learning right across the process with regards to EEDI, to really address that gap. The fifth one is to share power of children, young people and families, and also practitioners. And there's further detail on this in the report, but really it is about dedicated capacity building. We know there is a great amount of good work going on, but to build on that, to really be able to enable partnerships to understand the how-to and the good practice. But also to think about how earlier, more regular and consistent communication and feedback can be part of the process, as well as that systematic involvement, not just with reviews, but throughout the business of the partnerships. And finally, we have proposed that national government respond annually to key recommendations in panel national reviews. So to really provide a much greater feedback loop, a sense that the system is listening, that there is somewhere for recommendations to go, and for those connections and a dialogue to be made, not just at national level, but through the local, regional and national, so that all leaders involved understand where the priorities need to be. And finally and quickly, the report proposes a further phase to this work to really start to test out some of these ideas, and to think about how multi-agency learning can be transformed, really thinking more about how to streamline reviews, how to focus more on thematic reviews, which we know there is an appetite for, but also to create capacity in the system to also focus on when things go well, to get away from the sense that learning is really only tied to when things go wrong, but also to really focus on actually the strengths in the system, which we know are there. So over to Alison for the final closing next steps.
Thank you. So what are the next steps? So this report has been published in the context of major multi-agency safeguarding practice reforms. I'm sure you're well aware of that, including the establishment of a Child Protection Authority. This context is actually really important because it will provide us with opportunities for working differently in the best interests of children and of learning. The report provides a really strong evidence base for truly joined up multi-agency working, and we've been very pleased with this report. But the report is to us in government, so the panel and government and safeguarding partners need to now reflect on the research and the 6 proposed priorities for change and how best we can take these forward together. Thank you. Over to Steve. Back to Steve.
Great, thank you very much indeed, and appreciate the effort in containing that with so much information into the time allocated. So now this is the 20 minutes of Q&A interaction. So you are welcome to raise your hand in MS Teams and come off mute and ask your question the old-fashioned style. But as you consider what your questions are, I'm going to just sort of summarize what has come into the forum in case the presenters haven't had a chance to look at it. But certainly the initial discussion about the process and how rapid reviews became serious case reviews, or LSEPR, sorry, were sort of tackled. So specifically the criteria for rapid reviews, and a number of responses already to that. You can see number 9 and number 10 are giving some guidance as to where those rapid reviews come from, and number 8 as well has a question. A lot of rapid reviews identify the same issues. Multiple local authorities are all addressing these themes individually. There needs to be a national coordination of learning. And that is also reflected in question 25, if you just scroll to the bottom, which says, is there space for a learning framework for high quality learning events, for partnerships, panels reviewing and national learning, says partnerships doing it their own. Is it, Emma, would you want to respond to that? Is that something you picked up in your session about systems approach and the priorities?
Yes, there is space in the learning framework. I mean, what we have proposed is that should be some further work undertaken on a learning framework, which would be a very collaborative process with partnerships in the spirit of continuous learning. And yes, it's a good idea, because actually, and to link to the comment above about a sort of, efficiencies in the system and duplicitous findings, the idea of a learning framework would be to provide that coherence, to enable partnerships more flexibilities to refine what they do, and to be really clear, linked into your business as usual, into your audit processes, into your wider knowledge of where your priorities are in your locality, to be making some decisions about where learning is needed in your local area. That is one of the key things, that decision needing to know why you would undertake further in-depth review. But at the moment, there's a sense that it just needs to happen over and over again, rather than there being some sort of judicious decision-making around that. But having said that, some partnerships are more equipped to do that decision-making than others. And so it comes back to ensuring that a learning framework is an enabling tool, but is also in the context of increasing and enabling capacity across the system.
Excellent, thank you, Emma. And in terms of the national learning kind of review process, there's also a comment which is 22, which is the NWRIPP is a brilliant example of regional learning that could be extended. If anybody who doesn't mind saying more about that, they're welcome to put their hand up in Teams and come off mute and talk to us about that. There's some obvious good learning from there. There is a question about sort of on the back of that, Emma, about the impact on the business management teams for the panels, and certainly the level of fatigue. Maybe Nikki, you can speak to this about capability and capacity, and where it lands in the partnerships for these learnings to be kind of disseminated and distributed, often landing up with the business managers. We're looking at numbers 13 and 15 were the comments on the back of that. Nikki?
Yeah, I think in relation to the business units, there was a real sense that whilst working together has moved us into an era of shared and equal responsibility, that the business units are typically hosted by the local authority. So it's very variable around funding and capacity. So I think that speaks to the point that we were saying around a multi-agency framework and approach, and what is the role of the business unit fundamentally in servicing some of the reviews. I also think that there's a big question over funding and the contribution of statutory agencies within that, so which is wider than reviews, but was a topic of interest.
Great, thank you. Also, sorry, Jeanette, you have your hand up. Quick.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in there because I think there was some interesting reflections from our participants about the process. So we've said that it was important learning starts right from the beginning of the process. But there was some reflection on the scope of rapid reviews, because they need to happen when there's a serious incident notification, whereas there's more discretion about when you move on to an LCSPR. And I think there's an important debate to be had around the numbers of, the amount of work that rapid reviews are generating. And we certainly had some discussions about the original purpose of rapid reviews and whether there was a sense almost of mission creep in relation to those. So I think that's worth something to think about, as well as the number of other reviews that are going on in different spaces at the same time.
Yeah, excellent. And we'll come back we're delighted to have a few reviewers on the call today as well. So we'll pick up on those questions in a moment. But John, you have your hand up.
It was only because you mentioned the Northwest RIP, which brilliant. Is now, I think, a learning hub. Nikki will know more about the new name, but I've been working up with all the Northwest RIP, and they're bringing all of the partnerships together in the Northwest, sharing learning, sharing best practice, and trying to get some consistency. So it's a great model from a regional point of view that I think has definitely some potential for other parts of the country. So but I know Nikki works within the RIP as well. So I thought I'd just share that.
Thank you very much, John. Nikki, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think the point about regional learning posed some interesting conversations and discussions, and I certainly think there's something about health and police probably being able to be held more accountable at a regional level as well. And in some of the focus groups, what we heard was at that regional level, those agencies particularly can see themes across their system and repetition in terms of recommendations and reviews. So that was quite interesting, and hence the question we sort of posed around, is there a gap at that regional level where we start to consider learning and recommendations? But just again, speaking to Jeanette's point, something else that we heard from other agencies, with the business unit being almost like the engine room and the host of reviews, that sometimes that could pose almost some gatekeeping activity, and sometimes agencies not referring in, thinking that that their incident might not meet the threshold, or particularly when we're looking at things like outside harms. So there were some interesting observations around the role of the business unit, sort of being that coordination for all agencies.
Thank you, Nikki. Can we now just pick up on the couple of comments from reviewer colleagues? So number 18 says, as a reviewer, to get the reflexive and reflecting learning, there needs to be an understanding of where the partnership is in terms of its own current capability. This can affect the depth of reflection and learning. And perhaps as we're on the subject, number 23 and 24, it would be great to have professional development for independent reviewers, but some of the problems we have is the time it takes to them to agree to sign contracts, up to 6 months in some cases. So a big delay being built into that process. And a comment, I agree. I would advocate that a time frame of 6 months should start from when the contract is signed, rather than when we are sent the R&R. We send the rapid review to the panel. So something about time frames, something about the impact of reviewers, something about the professional development of reviewers. Who can pick that up? Emma, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yes, I mean, I think in terms of independent reviewers, these points that are made here about contracts and some of these really sort of practical constraints, you know, they're all interrelated, and actually what we're suggesting is that this needs to be looked at in the round, because actually there isn't a system, there isn't an infrastructure around independent reviewers, and there is something that can be addressed there to support with the very practical, such as things like the contracting processes, and that could be something that, for example, hubs such as the one in the Northwest can be looking at. You know, what are some coherence and consistency across contracting approaches and so on, and that you know, I think there's space for that. In terms of the time frame, that's something for potentially the panel to think through, but I think that the overarching finding for us was that there is delay in the system because of the inability to also identify independent reviewers who have got the relevant expertise and who are not necessarily always the same individuals for a particular place or region. So there is a real challenge there that does need to be looked at in the round.
Thank you. So that's a recruitment problem, or getting the right level of quality of reviewers, you know, equally across the country.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Sally?
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on the timeframe issue, Steve. So we are constrained by the legislation on this. It is in the relevant legislation and in Working Together 23 around that 6-month timeframe, and similarly the timeframe for the notification. So we'd require things to change for us to be able to pass those changes on to you. And I also noticed, just while I've got the microphone, number 30 talks about needing improved guidance and some sort of rapid review template. The revised panel guidance will be published imminently, and then the next piece of work to undertake is getting something, a rapid review framework out to partnerships, and again we'll be looking for partnerships to assist us with that. We wouldn't want it to be a template because we know all children and their experiences are different, but we are looking to develop a framework.
Excellent. So thank you. And I think there's also a discussion going on about the value of a national learning framework. So and 25 is talking about a high quality learning events for partnerships, panel reviews and national learning. So saves partnerships all doing themselves. So some sort of collective process, you know, maybe online rather than having people physically meet to look at specific learning outcomes and how those can be applied locally. And 25 as well. I've talked about 25, sorry. And then another debate about, is there space for a national log of learning or place where SCPs can go to have a look at proactive learning and improve services? I know that there are expectations around that from the national panel, and working on a number of projects around that. Yeah, I think the number of other comments that are coming in will get the panel to respond to and then publish that as part of the outcomes from the webinar. But I want to give Susie Kitching the floor, as you got your hand up. Susie, find that mute button.
Yeah, sorry, I couldn't do it. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just quickly, it was my question around the partnerships and that reflective learning, because you talked a lot about it being a learning process, and my experience as a reviewer is that depending on which partnership, where they're at, their capacity, and also in terms of their own capabilities in lots of change in partnership, that can affect the quality of the review. I've done one recently, huge impact for me in terms of review about the learning and the reflection that comes along in the process. So that can really affect the quality of the review. Great system, you know, I'm very collaborative and I learn as I'm doing my reviews as well, you know, and I think it's really important that we recognise that that process does involve who's in the room. You know, that starts not only with your practitioners, but your quality assurance groups, the panel groups are really, really reflective, have some really rich conversations, really rich.
Thank you, Susie. That's a great point. The comment right at the bottom, 42, did I hear that right? Imminent publication of the guidance. Sally, I think you said that guidance, tried to avoid the use of the word template, but do you have a rough idea when that might be out from the panel?
I can't confirm, but it will be very shortly. Yeah. Fine.
Okay, great. And another comment, 39, adults have adopted the RR process and community safety too. So, interesting to consider what might be learned from your colleagues on the adult side. Talking about 37, so the significant disparities in the number of notifications. So right back to that kind of process for when a rapid review and a SIN becomes a LSCPR. There are significant disparities in the number of notifications and therefore RRs across the country, which are not easily explained. Did this get picked up in the work? Emma, you got your hand up. I hope you might answer that.
A little bit is the answer to that, but we have flagged in the report that we think further investigation is needed on the varying rates of SINs, and the SIN data has since been published. This most recent tranche of data on SINs, so there is something going on, and actually if you read the report you'll see there is some nuance around decision making, and that there are some differences of interpretation of the policy framework, and that is probably leading some differences, as well as actually to go back to Susie's point around the sort of the capabilities and the capacity within different partnerships. It really does come down to that a lot of the time. Some of the areas that were involved in this work, had maybe a 2 days a week person in post, and others have a full-time well-oiled machine. There's a lot of variability across the system, so it's something worth noting.
Good, and something that perhaps can be picked up at that national level as well in terms of disseminating of the learning. Sandra, I will pick up on your involvement with the VCSE organisations, and if they were involved in the care of the individual, how is this addressed amongst that of the agencies? Perhaps a quick comment on that, then I'll come back to you, Jeanette. What about the voluntary agencies and their involvement?
Did you want me to pick that one up, Steve?
Yes, please, Sally.
So what tends to happen is when safeguarding partnerships make a notification, they should be thinking about who has been involved in and looking after that child and the family and all the support that they've had. And from that list of involved agencies, they should be then inviting them to be part of the rapid review and onward to LCSPR if that happens.
Thank you. Good. So we're sort of out of time. Maybe one or two comments. Jeanette, you had your hand up. Did you want to pick up on anything from RIP?
Yeah, it was just to continue from Emma's point around the serious incident notifications being down, just to say that there was an appetite for sharing those conversion rates and thinking together about how decisions are being made at each point in the process, and I think that's definitely further work that needs to be done. And then just off the back of the comment on voluntary agencies, I think there was a sense that voluntary agencies would be co-opted and be involved. I think there is an issue about making sure people have adequate support if they're not involved very regularly in the review processes, to ensure that they can really take part in the best way possible to produce the best learning.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much, Jeanette. And thanks to all our presenters. They will pick up on some of the comments and questions that we'll add the responses that we've made verbally here, but also pick up on some other of the themes in there. Sarah Park, thank you for sharing that rapid review process flowchart in the MS Teams chat. I'll put that into the report as well, make sure that's included. Thanks to everybody who's made comments. You can, of course, keep in touch with the work of the panel and obviously go back and review this commissioned report by the panel when you get a chance if you haven't already. I want to thank all our presenters. We're sort of out of time, but Sally, do you want to close us out? Thanks for your help.
Sorry. Just thanks for everybody for attending today. I think we've had some really insightful comments and some great discussion, and we can take this back into our own considerations of the project. So I hope everybody's found it useful, and thank you for your input today.
Great. And finally, a message from Amina in the chat. There is a link to a post-webinar evaluation survey. We'd be very grateful if you'd add your comments and feedback on the structure, the process, the timing and so on of this webinar. So please click that link and add your thoughts to that. Thanks for spending your lunchtime with us. I hope you have a good rest of day, and thank you. Goodbye.